Thomas Furlong was one of the earliest and most well-known private investigators in the United States. He spent more than 50 years working in criminal investigations, most of which were closely connected to railroad crimes. In the year 1912, he founded a private detective agency that carried his own name, and later published his famous book titled 50 Years as a Detective. In that book, he documented real cases and true stories he personally faced throughout half a century of investigative work. Today, we are focusing on one of the most dangerous and infamous cases he described, a crime that became known as one of the most notorious train robberies of the early 20th century. This is the story of the Glencoe train robbery in the state of Missouri in the year 1910. This was not an ordinary robbery. Thomas Furlong lived every moment of this case, from the instant it occurred until the gang was finally captured. On the night of the 21st of February in the year 1910, at a small railway station known as Glencoe in the state of Missouri, the cold was unbearable. The station was modest and quiet, and the freezing wind forced people to wrap themselves tightly in heavy coats, waiting impatiently for the train to arrive so they could escape the bitter weather and continue toward their destinations. In one corner of the station, two men stood apart from the crowd. The first was William Lowe, a man of short stature and heavy build. The second was George Eberling, his complete opposite, tall and thin. Standing side by side, the contrast between them was impossible to miss. Moments before the train arrived, William leaned closer and whispered, asking if everything was ready, and warning that there was no room for mistakes tonight. George replied calmly, assuring him that everything was under control, and that by the end of the night they would leave with exactly what they had planned for. As they spoke, the distant sound of the approaching train echoed along the tracks. The long-awaited moment had arrived. When the train finally stopped at the station, the two men wasted no time. They leapt onto a section near the front of the train known as the blind baggage area, a space close to the engine that was usually empty and strictly off-limits to passengers. Hidden in that compartment, they carefully observed the movement of the passengers and the train crew, especially those responsible for ensuring everyone had boarded. They stayed alert, constantly watching their surroundings, knowing that discovery at this stage would end everything. Only when the train began to move did they finally feel safe. As the wheels rolled forward and the station faded behind them, they knew the first phase of their plan had succeeded. Their confidence grew with every passing second. Once the train entered a dark stretch of track, William and George moved through the water tanks toward the engine cabin. When they reached the compartment where the engineer and his assistant were operating the train, they drew their pistols without hesitation and aimed them directly at both men. The engineer turned in shock, staring at the guns pointed at him as shouts filled the cabin. William and George warned them clearly. Follow every instruction or a single bullet would send them flying off the train. Both robbers wore masks that concealed their faces, leaving only their eyes visible. William immediately moved toward the control panel and began slowing the train with steady confidence. It was obvious he knew exactly what he was doing. This was not his first time handling a locomotive. George, acting as the leader of the operation, kept his weapon trained on the engineer and his assistant. He ordered them to guide him to the mail car and demanded that the mail car and the engine be separated from the passenger cars. Under threat, the crew complied. The train was split apart, leaving the passengers behind, as the engine and mail car continued forward. Inside the passenger cars, confusion spread as the train suddenly slowed. People looked around, unaware of what had just taken place, until they realized the mail car was gone. With the second stage of the plan completed successfully, William took control of the engine and drove it approximately 3 miles east from the point where the passenger cars had been left behind. When they finally stopped, all 4 men disembarked and headed toward the mail car. Inside, the darkness was thick and the cold relentless. Surrounded by sealed bags and heavy parcels, William and George pulled out knives and began cutting through the mail sacks. Their focus was clear. Any bag that felt heavy, any package that could contain money. Visibility was poor, and the tension grew by the second. George urged William to hurry, reminding him that time was against them. They tore through bag after bag, some filled with letters, others with parcels, and some containing cash. As the robbery continued, the stakes rose with every sound echoing through the night. They took only what they could carry. They did not open the bags any further. Instead, they grabbed several sealed mail sacks, still tightly closed, and jumped down from the train. Once on the ground, weighed down by their load, they turned back to the engineer and his assistant and warned them to return to the passenger cars and resume the journey as if nothing had happened. Moments later, William and George disappeared into the darkness, heading straight into the open fields ahead. Neither the engineer nor his assistant ever saw them again. This escape was no accident. It was part of a carefully calculated plan. As they crossed the field, the weight of the bags became overwhelming. Each sack felt as heavy as stone. They took a few steps, collapsed, stood again, and kept moving. Still, greed pushed them forward. They convinced themselves that one of those bags might contain a fortune, something far more valuable than they had imagined. They were not wandering aimlessly. They knew exactly where they were going. Before the robbery, they had prepared a hiding place deep in the fields. After a long and exhausting walk, they finally reached a large pile of dried corn husks. This was the spot they had chosen in advance. There, beneath the corn husks, they buried everything they had stolen from the train, carefully memorizing the location. With that, the third phase of their plan was complete. The next step waited nearby. Not far from the hiding place ran a river, and hidden among the trees along its bank was a wooden boat they had prepared earlier. They dragged the boat into the water, climbed aboard, and began rowing away from the site where they had buried their stolen treasure. As the distance grew between them and the crime scene, George broke into hysterical laughter. He was thrilled, convinced they had succeeded completely. He told William that the plan had worked perfectly, that no one had noticed them and that they had vanished without a trace. William, however, was far less relaxed. He warned George to calm down, reminding him that it was far too early to celebrate. The real test, he said, would come in the following days. Only then would they know whether they had truly escaped. George's excitement faded quickly. After traveling several miles along the river, they reached the shore they had planned for. They abandoned the wooden boat and continued on foot toward the city of St. Louis. Their goal was simple: disappear into the crowds of a large, busy city where no one would recognize them. The following day, on the 22nd of February, events unfolded exactly as they had expected. The engineer and his assistant rejoined the rest of the train crew and the passengers, who eventually arrived safely at their destinations. Once the train reached its station, the robbery was officially reported. The news spread rapidly. Newspapers across the country carried the story on their front pages. The bold headlines described a daring robbery of the Glencoe mail train, and the public became obsessed with one question: who were the criminals behind it? The police had no answers, no suspects, no leads. The robbers had worn masks and no one could identify them. But that same day, hundreds of miles away in New York City, Thomas Furlong read the story in the morning newspaper. In those days, newspapers were the primary source of information, and Furlong, like millions of others, began his day reading the headlines. As he studied the article, something caught his attention. The descriptions provided by the train crew immediately triggered his memory. Based solely on those details, Thomas Furlong became convinced he knew exactly who the robbers were. Without hesitation, he sent a telegram to the manager of his office in St. Louis, instructing him to contact Dixon, the chief postal inspector responsible for Missouri. The message was clear and direct. Thomas Furlong knew the identity of the criminals, knew their history, and knew where to find them. He informed Dixon that he would arrive in St. Louis on Saturday, and that when he did, he would personally deliver the men responsible for the robbery. Days later, Thomas Furlong arrived in St. Louis, where Dixon was waiting anxiously. When they met, Furlong explained his reasoning. Based on the descriptions published in the newspapers, he was certain that one of the robbers was William Lowe. He then revealed William's criminal past. 11 years earlier, William Lowe had been involved in another train robbery, one carried out at Leeds Junction. In that crime, the mail car had been blown open with dynamite. Everyone involved in that earlier robbery had been sent to trial. William Lowe was the only one who walked free after agreeing to testify and confess to the details of the crime. He had even promised Thomas Furlong and the local authorities that he would never return to such crimes again. But now history was repeating itself, and Thomas Furlong was already closing in. The public prosecutor had also promised that William would be given a chance to live a normal life, to abandon crime and become a law-abiding citizen. Because William had confessed fully and concealed nothing, the charges against him were dropped, while his accomplices were prosecuted. William walked free and returned to an ordinary life. But what happened next changed everything. William later met George while working in railway switching yards, where tracks were manually controlled and redirected. At that time, nothing was automated. Every movement depended on human hands. The two men worked side by side, became close friends, and remained together for some time. Eventually, they moved on to another company with the same type of work, this time in Minnesota. Throughout those years, Thomas Furlong never stopped watching William from a distance. He was convinced that it was only a matter of time before William would return to train robbery. After the Glencoe robbery, a seemingly insignificant detail triggered a major breakthrough. A small merchant from a village near Kansas City remembered that he had mailed a money transfer shortly before the robbery. The amount was modest, roughly $100, but the merchant was cautious. He had written down the serial numbers of the banknotes before sending them. When news of the robbery broke, the merchant immediately contacted the postal inspectors and informed them that his money might be among the stolen mail. That single action opened the first real lead in the case. The inspectors printed copies of the recorded serial numbers and distributed them to every bank in and around St. Louis. Not a single bank was left unchecked. Within a single day, the National Bank in Hot Springs, Arkansas, reported that one of the marked banknotes had appeared. The bank manager questioned the woman who had brought the money in and asked where it came from. She calmly explained that the payment had been made by one of her lodgers, a man named George, as payment for his room. From that moment on, investigators had a suspect. One of the postal inspectors traveled immediately to Hot Springs and rented a room next to George's in order to observe him closely. At the same time, attention turned toward William Lowe, who was then living in St. Louis. William was presenting himself as a successful businessman, confident and untouchable. The plan was clear. Both men would be arrested simultaneously. The following morning, after confirming their locations, Thomas Furlong, Postal Inspector Dixon, and the Chief of Detectives raided William Lowe's office in St. Louis. William was arrested at his desk, still playing the role of a respectable businessman. At the same moment, in Hot Springs, the inspector received the signal. George was arrested without warning. During questioning, George initially denied everything. He avoided direct answers and attempted to confuse the investigators, but when they showed him the marked banknotes and explained that they were part of the stolen mail, his resistance collapsed. George confessed. He revealed every detail: the planning, the execution, the escape, and William's role in the entire operation. He held nothing back. Both men were immediately transferred to the federal court in St. Louis. The trial became a public spectacle. Journalists filled the courtroom, and the public followed every moment closely, waiting to hear the final judgment. William entered the courtroom with his head held high, scanning the crowd confidently, acting as though he were innocent. His lawyer argued that there was no solid evidence linking William directly to the stolen money, insisting that the cash had been found only in George's possession. But George refused to protect him. He told the truth, and with every word George spoke, the case against William grew stronger. There was no turning back. George's confession was detailed and precise. He explained everything that had happened and led investigators to the exact location where the stolen mail sacks had been buried beneath a pile of dried corn husks. He showed them precisely where to dig. When the officers recovered the stolen property, the truth became undeniable. What shocked everyone, however, was the value of what had been taken. The entire robbery, all the risk and planning, had yielded only between $600 and $700. Even by the standards of that time, it was a surprisingly small amount compared to the chaos it had caused. Nevertheless, the evidence was overwhelming. In court, numerous proofs were presented that confirmed George's testimony. The engineer and his assistant described the robbery exactly as George had explained it, matching every detail of his account. This consistency convinced the jury that George was telling the truth and that the crime had unfolded exactly as described. By the end of April in the year 1910, the verdict was delivered. William Lowe was sentenced to 43 years in federal prison, to be served at Leavenworth Penitentiary. In addition, he was ordered to pay a fine of $3,000. If he failed to pay the fine, 2 additional years would be added to his sentence. George received a sentence of 18 years in prison and was also fined $3,000. But the case did not end there. A third man was brought into the investigation. His name was Jimmy Lowe, William's brother. Jimmy had been involved in planning the robbery from the beginning, making the original group 3 men rather than 2. However, on the night of the crime, Jimmy was heavily intoxicated and unable to participate. William and George abandoned him and carried out the robbery without him. Because of his role in planning the crime, Jimmy was sentenced to several months in prison. After serving his time, he was released and returned to a normal life, having never taken part in the actual robbery. Once imprisoned, George made a second, far more shocking confession. He admitted that between the years 1908 and 1909, he and William had carried out 11 separate train robberies. He provided detailed descriptions of each operation, including locations, methods, and escape routes. His information was so precise that authorities were able to recover some of the stolen property from earlier crimes. This final confession confirmed what Thomas Furlong had believed all along. He had known who the train robbers were long before their arrest. The Glencoe train robbery became a powerful example of how swiftly investigations could unfold when one small mistake exposed an entire criminal operation. A single banknote, casually spent, had led to the collapse of a gang that might otherwise have continued robbing trains undetected. Thomas Furlong later reflected on the case, noting that railroad companies at the time had offered enormous rewards for the capture of train robbers. The total rewards reached nearly $200,000, an extraordinary sum for that era. Yet, Furlong refused every reward. He believed justice was not something to be bought or sold. For him, the pursuit of criminals was a duty, not a transaction. He never accepted a single cent from the rewards offered. And with that, the story of the Glencoe train robbery came to an end.